Good evening, everyone. We'll wait just a minute here and be sure I've got everything set up. You'll have to forgive the way I look, but we've been out chasing cattle. We've got some stray cattle. We've got cattle that aren't stray, but we've got some that are stray that are on our property, and so we're having to take care of that. All right. Well, welcome to class 112. This class is going to be more informal than most, which are usually informal, but it will rely more on my own recollections of a few slides, but mostly trying to give you a sense of who my brother was, though many of you are familiar with his writings. And and many of you have seen his talks online, which many are available. He also has a website, or there is a website for his called William S. Hatcher Library, and he also has a spot on Wikipedia, very brief tribute to his work in the Baha'i Faith, in particular his work as a scholar in both math and philosophy, and in, of course, the Baha'i teachings. His main emphasis in his work was trying to reconcile science and religion, and one of his first articles he got published in a non-Baha'i publication was on the essential non-existence of evil, which he proved. And this is the method that he utilized in most of his work, was to use theoretical math and the terms and procedures of theoretical math to prove spiritual theories. And of course, his most famous one was the proving the existence of God. And we'll get to that. So let me begin by sharing my screen and going to the slides, a few that I have. And let me clear that out. Bill and I, a tribute to William S. Hatcher. And this is class 112. Bill was born in 1935, 5 years before I was. And so we were never really in the same place at the same time for a good while. And that is, when I was in grammar school, he was in high school. When I was in high school, he was in college, and so on. This doesn't mean we didn't do a lot of things together. And we had a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fights. Because he was always taller than everyone else, as you may, those of you who saw him, he was 6'6", and well, not when he was young, but when he grew up. But he was always quite taller than I, and so it was hard for me to hit him, because he would simply put his arm out on my head, and when all I could do was bruise his arm up a little bit. And that web down at the bottom, williamhatcher.org, is the website that contains the library of his works and his talks, and gives you access to those. This is a tribute to him. I believe it was from the Baha'i News. Throughout his life as a Baha'i, Dr. Hatcher served on numerous administrative bodies at the local, national, and national levels. He was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of Switzerland from 62 to 65, the National Spiritual Assembly of Canada from 83 to 91, and the National Spiritual Assembly of Russia, of the Russian Federation, in 1996. He played a vital role in prompting the academic study of the Baha'i Faith through helping to found the Association for Baha'i Studies in North America, and that was in 1975. In a message of condolence, the Universal House of Justice, the international governing body of the Baha'i Faith, said that the Baha'i world has lost one of its brightest minds, one of its most prolific pens, which is a lovely tribute to my brother. So let me just casually go through some of the things that came to my mind as I was thinking, well, what are the things that sort of revealed the complexity of who he was, or the distinction of who he was, because he was quite different, quite an individual, part of which was hard to deal with, and part of which made him a person that I relied on as a guide to not only what the truth might be about reality, but how to approach asking questions about reality. And to put it in the simplest terms, I don't know that I would have been a Baha'i but for him. Had anyone else introduced me to the faith, I just am not sure. Of course, we never know, do we? We feel fortunate, those of us who are Baha'is, that we came across it however we did. And I'll explain that more fully later. So Bill is a magician. Now, what does that mean? When we were growing up in Greensboro, and he was 10 or 12 years old, he and his friend up the street became fascinated by magic, not in the sense of real mystical, actual magic, but as performers. And so they started developing a magic show, and Bill would order these devices from New York, where was the stronghold of various tricks and devices you could buy to perform magic. And that, I think of these things and think, well, of course, Bill was interested in magic, but I look back on it, it's kind of strange, isn't it? That he was a performer. Bill and the violin, what does that have to do with? Well, when he was in there was a three-tiered system in Greensboro, North Carolina, when where we grew up. There was a elementary school, middle school, and high school. The same it is in many places. Where I grew up in Atlanta, there was just two tiers: elementary school and high school. So Bill in middle school was in the orchestra that they had, and he played the violin. Now, number one, it's interesting to me that he wanted to learn the violin, but what's particularly interesting is when we moved to Atlanta and he approached the leader of the orchestra to try out for the orchestra, the head of the orchestra had him play a piece and hand him a piece of music, and it turned out that he and Bill also realized he didn't know how to read music, that he had played by ear all this time, and nobody knew it. So he gave up the violin. Bill in chess. He was always interested in logic in all of its manifestation. Of course, chess is probably the most challenging game insofar as abstract thought and plotting and coming up with rational approaches to various challenges. And so he loved chess, always did. And back then, of course, there was no internet. And so in order to play people that he had met, he would play chess by mail, and they would just send a move on a postcard, and then the next person would send a move, and so on. So the game would take forever. He was a runner-up in the Atlanta Chess Championship, and he took pride in that. And I took pride in the fact that later on in our lives, much later, I played him a game and won, and told him I would never ever play him again, because I could say that, see, I won the last game we played. Even more to his disgruntlement was the fact that my son, James, uh, played him when James happened to be a chess prodigy. And at the very young age of about 12, well, it was at our mother's funeral, as a matter of fact. We were all in a hotel, and he had heard James was a good chess player, so he played James, and James beat him. And so they played until Bill won, which was took a couple of games. But he always loved chess, and he always had chess on his computer, and he was kind of renowned among some of the Baha'is as a chess player. I could go on and on about that. It's again, these are just sort of uh, spots of things that maybe give you an insight into Bill that's not evident when he gives these very sophisticated talks on logical proofs. An independent thinker. He never went along with the crowd much. He was not. He was social and sociable. Very good sense of humor, but he didn't go along with the crowd. And so from the very get-go, he wouldn't go to the same church as the rest of the family did. He was in the Methodist church, but he decided he wanted to go to another Methodist church than the one we went to because it had a more active youth group. And so that was sort of a precursor to his own decisions later when he became a Baha'i. His industriousness. Excuse me, let me go back. Even when he was like 10 or 12 years old, he wanted to earn his own way. And so he put together a box of wood with a leather strap on it and put stuff for shining shoes, shoe polish, brushes, and so on. Went around the neighborhood in Greensboro making money shining people's shoes. It's interesting in many ways, and I can't get into Bill in classical music. Very early, he loved classical music, and he would go to a music store that specialized in classical music in Atlanta, and would always his fondest Christmas present was the year he got a really nice record player with a big speaker in terms of what would happen later with sophisticated stereo equipment. This is before stereo. And he would not let me near it for fear that I might do something to it. And he would play his classical music on it. Well, there are several stories I could tell you about that, but I won't right now. Our sense of humor, we did things together. As I say, we were not much in competition. I was, let me put this, I was sort of I was an athlete, and I got involved in a lot of social activities and a lot of athletics. Bill did not, partly even though he, as you can see, was very tall and so on, and very strong, and liked to play tennis and other things. He wasn't much, he didn't like the team sports much. So even though, needless to say, in high school, the coaches wanted him to play basketball or football and so on. This is a picture that gives you an idea of the kind of silly stuff we did. Unbeknownst to him and Mother used to love to take pictures of us with this old Kodak, and on special occasions. What this occasion was, I don't know, but she had us go in the backyard and sit on this bench. And unbeknownst to either of them, I had my cap pistol in my pocket, and so I pulled it out when neither of them was looking. And when she was about to snap the picture, I said, "Drop the Kodak, Mom." And you can see Bill was totally surprised. And that's one of the purest pictures of his laughter I've ever seen. Bill teaches me the faith. Again, any one of these I could talk about for hours, but how did this happen? I had early inklings of something going on. We were both raised in the Methodist Church, and I was very interested in the youth group in my church and was president of the Methodist youth gatherings. And would have talks and discussion groups and so on. And during that time, this was my junior year in high school, while he was in college, and he was in college to prepare to become a minister. But he was also in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, and his thought was that he would go into the Army and become a minister in the service. And he got out of that because he realized that he would have the duty of, what should I say, of trying to make people feel better who had killed other people. And he realized that he couldn't in good conscience do that because he didn't believe in that. So somehow he talked himself out of the ROTC. And I say talk himself out of it because when you join that on the college level, you are in effect signing up to be a commissioned officer. But at any rate, around the time of his graduation, this is 1957, he took me on a picnic, and which was, I didn't think anything of it. Any place we went was strange, and so far as Bill was concerned, it was always something strange going on in his life. And I was just, I would tag along. And so he was with these people who, some of them were elderly and so on. And so one woman who was a very lovely Persian woman took me around these gardens. It was out in the country in Nashville. We both went to Vanderbilt. And so after we went around the gardens and had some snacks and so on, we went back to the university. And on the way, we stopped and got some ice cream at a drugstore. That was back when drugstores had ice cream. And we were sitting at the counter, and he said, "What did you think of those people?" And I said, "Well, they seemed very nice." And he said, "They were Baha'is." I said, "Oh, okay." And he says, I've come to believe in the Baha'i Faith. And I said, "Well, then why don't you become a Baha'i?" And he said, "I just did." So he had to give, that was the occasion where he declared himself. Now, how did he come in touch with the Baha'i Faith? I'll get to that later, but he had studied it in college, and as I say, he was studying to be a minister. So he had determined that he would not tell mom and dad. This was, of course, the end of the school year, and we would both be at home in Atlanta during that summer. And so he determined he wouldn't tell them until they noticed that he had become more spiritual and so on. And so when that didn't work, he told them point blank that he had become a Baha'i. And my father, who hated anything that was out of the ordinary, he liked everything to be smooth and orderly, was a bit upset. Mother was less so. And he told him that he was not going to go to, he had a scholarship to go to Yale Divinity School to become a minister, and he had to write the dean of Yale Divinity School and say that he wasn't coming after all because he had become a Baha'i. And that letter became the basis for a pamphlet called Letters to Christians. It was extremely well written, and it would not, needless to say, not only told the dean that he wouldn't be coming, but explained exactly why he felt that Baha'u'llah was the return of Christ. His subtlety and proficiency in teaching me. I naturally was interested because I was interested in anything. I knew that Bill, insofar, even though he was sort of an oddball in most the eyes of most people, I knew he would never do anything stupid. That his path in his life was always guided by logic, uh, not in some cold way, but that he would not become a Baha'i unless he found something true and substantial. So he, instead of imposing it on me in any way, he would only answer questions I asked. And so he taught me in a very beautiful way in that sense. So for the next 3 years, I studied the faith. And um, for 2 of those years, I was in Atlanta and then a freshman at Vanderbilt. And then my sophomore year, I declared myself. So my journey, that story is a very interesting one too, at least for me. Um, his manner in teaching others was much the same. But he would always find a way of bringing it up. And we would do a lot of direct teaching and so on at Vanderbilt, because we were at Vanderbilt for 1 year together, my freshman and sophomore, 2 years, my freshman and sophomore years. And then he and Judith moved to Switzerland, where he worked on his PhD at the University of Neuchâtel. So after studying, and again, it's a totally very long story of my own journey, which I talk about in a couple of my books. Understanding Death, I believe, is one that's fairly elaborate description of that. But suffice it to say, on New Year's Eve, 1959, this was Christmas break, and he was supposed to give a talk in Gainesville, Georgia, but he got ill. And so Judith, his wife, and I went in his stead to this presentation on the Baha'i Faith. And I found that even though I wasn't a Baha'i, I ended up answering most of the questions that the non-Baha'is had. And I also realized that I really was sure that I wanted to be a Baha'i. And the only reason I was not a Baha'i was that I had promised my father, who knew that I admired Bill's acumen and Bill's approach to things like this, that I wouldn't become a Baha'i until I'd finished college. So it was on that same, after I declared on New Year's Eve, I told my father, I'm sorry, but I can't keep my promise to you. I'm right now, I'm nothing. I can't accept what I used to believe, insofar as what I was being taught in the sermons at the Methodist Church, and yet I wasn't a Baha'i. I was just nothing. And so my father hugged me and said, it's okay, don't worry about it. And so I declared, I became a Baha'i. Bill in college, his sons and our cousins, what's that about? And again, I'm sort of bouncing all around here. He was 6'6". We had, and that was his Hatcher genes. My father was 6'3.5". I was the runt of the family at 6'2". And we had cousins up in Franklin, Tennessee, where my father was from, who were 6'8", 6'7", and 6'6". And the most interesting story in that regard is that 4 of them or 5 of them went to the city reservoir one night in Franklin and took off their clothes and went swimming in the reservoir, and the police came and caught them. And here they were, these giants in the nude, and they all had a big laugh. I don't think they had to do any time for that. Getting out of ROTC, I've told you about. One thing Bill realized early on was that he liked to write. And he in addition to the mat. And so he and another individual who was an independent thinker decided that they would write um, a column in the Hustler, which was the Vanderbilt newspaper, and they called it Commodore Manifesto, which is a takeoff on Lenin's or Marx's Communist Manifesto. And Jerry Christie, this is one of the issues. I can't tell the whole thing. Suffice to say, he did a parody on the crucifixion of Christ, only it was the fraternity system of blackballing that he was parodying. So this is, again, the kind of humor he had, but it was humor that was aimed at something he found rather incongruent with his beliefs as a Christian and his examination of the faith. So it was during his undergraduate years in a comparative religions course that he came across the Baha'i Faith around 1956, 57. And, well, no, 56 it would have been. And so there happened to be a very fine Baha'i community in Nashville. And they consisted of people like Sarah Pereira, who became a auxiliary board member, and that's when the auxiliary board was auxiliary to the Hands of the Cause, and have a very important position. Robert Hayden, who became the first Black Baha'i to be Poet Laureate of the United States, was in that community, and his wife, Irma Hayden, who was a concert pianist, and on and on. So many prominent individuals were in that community. And so it was a very, what should I say, it represented the faith extremely well, and they could explain the faith to him really well. And so he learned the faith through them and declared on his graduation day in 1957 and began to teach me. The letter to the dean of Yale Divinity School, I've already mentioned. His decision not to tell mom and dad, I've told you about. And so he pursued theoretical math, then getting a master's degree in that before he moved to Pioneer with Judith to Switzerland, where he was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly, and where he got his degree in theoretical math, his PhD. And as a member of the NSA, during the period of 1963, when the first election of the House of Justice was held, he was at that election in the Holy Land, and then attended the first World Congress as well. And again, this is going back and forth a bit. He met his wife, Judith Bernstein, as her name was then, at Davidson, which is now Lou Helen Baha'i School. They fell in love, deeply in love, even though she was 5 years younger than he. I think she was 16 at the time. They got married when she was about 17 or 18, and decided to move to Switzerland, where he pursued his PhD. He was elected to the NSA, as I said, attended the first election of the first House of Justice. And then in a few years, they returned to the United States and decided to pioneer to Quebec City, a French-speaking province of Quebec, and because they both were very fluent in French. And he was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly of Canada. They had wonderful results in teaching the faith in Quebec and built up a very strong community there. Also on that National Assembly was Doug Martin, later became a member of the House of Justice, very, very fine individual. And so Doug and Bill and Hossein Danesh and Don Rogers decided to start the first association for Baha'i studies. And this was a very important milestone in the development of Baha'i scholarship throughout the world, because other countries decided to have their own association. And of course, it still exists, and it's grown remarkably. And so this was an incredible, inspirational thing to do. He, during his these years, assisted the World Center in various missions and capacities, helping with writing various documents and so on. Then later, much later in his life, after having 3 children, he and Judith pioneered to Russia after the children were grown and on their own, where he lectured, and he was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly of Russia. Of course, they had to learn Russian first, and so they spent a year doing that. It was there that he wrote the first version of a book called Love, Power, and Justice. And the book he wrote before that, now this is Bill right here, as you can see. He's the tallest one. The National Spiritual Assembly of Switzerland. And I believe this lady here is the widow of Horace Holly, who was on that assembly. This is Bill, I believe, in Quebec, but I'm not positive. He traveled so much and talked so many different places. Bill's books, he didn't write that many books. I mean, he wrote quite enough, but they were milestone accomplishments. The first one he wrote was a book on foundations of mathematics, a book on theoretical math, which was used as a textbook in many universities. That's in 1968. He wrote a book called Absolute Algebra with co-author Stephen Whitney in 78. The Science of Religion in 1980. The Logical Foundations of Mathematics, which was a revised version of the Foundations of Mathematics. And then this important one here, which is this book here, which you're probably all familiar with, is probably the most noteworthy introductory book, and still is, to the Baha'i Faith. The Baha'i Faith, the Emerging Global Religion, which he wrote in 84, though it's been revised and republished many times since. Logic and Logos, Essays on Science, Religion, and Philosophy. And this was the heart of what he loved to discuss, and is the unity of science and religion, and the proofs, using science to prove spiritual verities, and conversely using spiritual verities to show that they are the counterpart of various physical laws. Together, he and I, after being together and teaching a course at Lou Helen Baha'i School, decided we should write a book together. And so we put together several of our essays that were on either the Kitab-i Aqdas, which of course had come out in 1993, and the result of that is called The Law of Love Enshrined. The next thing he became involved with is the concept of justice and authenticity of ethics, and what is true justice as expressed in the human condition. And he wrote The Ethics of Authenticity, which began what was called the Authenticity Project, which endured a number of years, about 10 years. And related to that was Love, Power, and Justice. And then the final work he wrote is perhaps the most important, in that is minimalism, a bridge between classical philosophy and the Baha'i revelation. And this is where his most elaborate proof of the existence of God, as well as proof of the nature of God. It's one thing to prove that there is a being responsible for creation, some first cause. It's quite another to prove, well, what is this cause like? So it's very important work, especially for those who are in the sciences, and even more importantly, for those who have a knowledge of theoretical logic. These are some of the beliefs that interested him the most, as I've just said. The essential non-existence of evil was the first one where he used his knowledge and love of math, which he believed to be, as many scientists do, the most reliable language, the truest language, insofar as describing reality is concerned. And so he proved the essential non-existence of evil, which is, of course, something that Abdu'l-Baha also does in Some Answered Questions. He proved the existence of God, the nature of God, and the nature of authentic justice. This is, I think, one of the better pictures of Bill, the power of him. As you can see, he's almost in a he gets this look where he's not really looking at anyone when he's speaking. He's in his own world, but he was an incredibly gifted speaker, very well organized, needless to say, and knew exactly where he was going. One thing interesting about working with him as co-authors of a book and his writing practice, how just different it was from my own. I revise and revise and revise and so on. He would hardly ever revise anything, and he was very sensitive should editors change much of what he wrote. And there's some stories I could tell you about the back and forth on that. Special projects for the House of Justice. Rather than tell you those, just say that that should be an S for justice. I'll fix that. And this is simply various research projects or various documents they wanted to put together on certain subjects. And he was one of the ones that they relied on to help put these things together. This is a picture of him as kind of fuzzy, out of focus. You can see him breaking up here. He's with Isaac Asimov, and he associated with some of the great minds of his time, as someone in his field would. Asimov, of course, was not a scientist per se, but was a creative writer, but very much appreciated in the world of science and science fiction. Throughout the years, he would caution me about some specific things that came to mind. One of the first one was about certitude. This was very important to me because when I became a Baha'i, I was at Vanderbilt, and while he was still there, and one of the first things he said to me, he says, certitude is so important. He says, you've got to have such certitude that if I myself became a covenant breaker or just quit the Baha'i faith, it wouldn't shake your own fidelity and your own belief. And that meant a lot to me, and it made me realize that whatever I believed about the faith had to be based on my own study of the faith and not on anyone else. And that's true. It's so important that your faith as a Baha'i has to be based on the writings. And if you're going to have anyone as your hero, it's got to be the manifestation or Abdu'l-Baha or Shoghi Effendi, of someone of that caliber, because anyone else is going to have flaws. So it's got to be this independent investigation of truth must lead to your own certitude, because an interesting thing happened in relation to that. Shortly after he told me this, there was an individual in the community, in the Nashville community, who began associating with some covenant breakers who lived in Chattanooga at the time. Now, for those of you who don't know, a covenant breaker is not just someone who's resigned from the Baha'i Faith. It's someone who's in the Baha'i Faith but is trying to undermine the institutions of the Baha'i Faith for whatever reason, for their own glorification, or just who knows. There are a variety of reasons. So this friend of ours began associating with these covenant breakers, and so Sarah Pereira, who was the auxiliary board member of protection, said that this individual shouldn't be associated with until things got straightened out, and that was her job. So Bill told me, he says, look, I know you like this individual, and he was an artist, and I loved to watch him work, and we had a lot of good communication. He said, you're going to have to stay away from him. And I said, oh, okay. And he told me why. And I said, well, doesn't that mean you have to as well? And he just was taken aback, because he realized, oh, the same verity he had taught me applied to him as well. At any rate, same thing about fidelity, and then Bill's escape in the middle of the night. What is that about? He was, and at the time we had to be very cautious that this was back in the day when we were literally advised not to try to teach people from the Middle East, not just in the Middle East, but from the Middle East, because at the time there were many people who would try to infiltrate the community, find out the names of the Baha'is back in Iran, so they would be persecuted. And so it was a precarious situation. So he lived in a house that was a rooming house, and also in that house was an individual who was Middle Eastern. I forget where he was from, but he began to asking Bill about the community and who the members were. And so he calls me in the middle of the night and says, I've got to move out of here. He was taking precautions. So I went to his apartment, and he had, this is literally true, a blanket, a bedspread in the middle of the floor. And he began putting everything he belonged into the middle of that. And then we folded up the corners like Santa Claus. He put it over his back and took it to the car. That was Bill's idea of moving. That gives you another insight. I consulted with him about fraternal life at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, as a university, was very interested in, or not very interested in it. If you weren't in a fraternity or a sorority, you really were sort of persona non grata, or just non-existent. And I was in a fraternity, or had pledged to be in a fraternity, same one he had been in. I said, Bill, since they have this system that he had criticized in his own parody of the fraternity system, the blackball system, where you pass around a box and everybody puts in a ball. No one can see who puts what kind in. You put a white ball if you agree to accept into the fraternity the individual who's being discussed. And if anyone puts in a black ball, he's out. That is the individual being discussed. And to me, this was blatant. Well, it wasn't just that. It just wasn't, I felt as a Baha'i, because they did forbid membership by people of color and people of other religions and so I just felt like I couldn't in good conscience stay in it. And so I consulted with him, and I went before the members of the fraternity and told them that they were very nice people, but I had to get out. And so I did. So that's when later on they went next year, went to Switzerland. I went to Spain. And so at Christmas time, I went from Spain to visit them in Neuchâtel. And we all had a great time going sledding down this great this mountain that's behind Neuchâtel, which sits on a lake, but behind it is this mountain that goes up, and lots of skiing and so on. And one of the lovely things there was Bill was on a sled, and of course he's rather large, and the sled went into this huge snowbank, and Bill disappeared. At any rate, I remember his head finally sticking out, and he was not happy. They go to Canada, as I said, and I go to Florida, where I've remained ever since. And they go to Russia later on, and I stay in Florida. So, important conversations through the years. Bill and I, even though I was in English literature and he was in math, I still loved and still do logic and approaching things logically. And so we could discuss various Baha'i theories and how they applied to the physical world. And so when I was visiting them in that Christmas break in 1961, we discussed evolution and how you could prove it, and what was the evidence of some spiritual intervention in the course of human evolution to demonstrate that there's some divine process at work. I won't tell you the result of that because it changed several times after that. We taught together at Greenacre. Excuse me just a second. John? I need to call you back. I'm doing a Zoom program right now. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. I'll call you back. Someone calling about the cattle. They're trying to help me out. All the neighbors are trying to figure out whose cattle they are. Because there are lots of cattle around here. We taught together at Greenacre, and then we taught together at Llewellyn, and that's when we decided to write the book on the Agdos. We just had continuous conversations. That was the most delightful 4 days or so that we ever had together, which because neither of our wives were there, so it was just the two of us in rooms next to each other, and we just, when we weren't teaching our courses, we were discussing various philosophical and theological theories. It was just delightful. We wrote the book together in '96. We consulted on science and religion when he assisted me in writing the book Close Connections, the bridge between, no, not the bridge. I forget the rest of the title, but at any rate, it's about the unity of science and religion. And in fact, there were some revisions required, and they had to be very precisely written to correct them. This was on evolution, as a matter of fact. And so he seemed very tired. He was in London, Ontario, about to teach a class the next day. And so he said, he tried to explain to me what I had wrong or what I had not stated clearly. And finally, he just gave up and said, John, just put down the words that I say. And so I did. And he died that night. It was very strange, totally unexpected. And at any rate, that meant a lot to me that he had helped me with that. And I say so, I believe, in the introduction to that book. One of the things we always focused on was, or at least I focused on, is the relationship between the two dimensions of reality, the spiritual dimension and the physical dimension, because I relied very heavily in my discussions on the statement by Abdu'l-Baha that the physical dimension and the spiritual dimension, the physical dimension is the exact counterpart of the spiritual dimension. And Bill said that, well, he doesn't mean it's exact. And I said, well, that's what he says. And so we never finished that conversation. Maybe we will in the next round. And we discussed a great deal about the concept of action at a distance, which we've been discussing in our classes, our last several classes, and we'll finish discussing next week and the week after that. This is the cover of the book we did together. One thing you can't see or appreciate fully, this is my daughter, Jill, did this. She's a wonderful artist, is right here. If you can see the image very faintly of my father, and this is my mother, and the entwinement of this flame and this rose, exemplifying the law of love, is just so thoughtful and imaginative and beautiful. This was the work I was working on, the second version of it, the bridge between spiritual and physical reality. I was right. So this was the book we were working on the night he passed. Bill and an Arabic hidden word number one. And these are just some things that he said or noted that remind me of the concept of justice as described in Arabic hidden word number one. Only in the infallible are infallible. All are exhorted to discover the truth for themselves as it speaks to their distinct life experiences and guides them on their unique path. We are free to study, speculate, postulate, and share, even mandated to do so. But the complete truth will forever be a goal towards which we strive, not some specific endpoint. These are my own words, but things we discussed together. This is Bill at one of the elections of the House of Justice in Haifa. And this is the last slide, and I will close. I had met Ali Naqshbandi a couple of times, once after a talk I gave in Canada. And then when I was in the Holy Land with Lucia, my wife, several years ago, at a conference of translators, he was there with his daughter, was one of those who was a translator, and Baha'i Naqshbandi. And she was accompanying him because he was, this was about the year before he died, or in his 90s at any rate. And he saw me and he came up and gave me a big hug, as he was accustomed to do. And he whispered in my ear, he said, Bill was one of the heroes. That's all he said, but I knew exactly what he meant. And I knew some of the things that Bill had done that were heroic. And I can't go into them because he did them on behalf of the House of Justice, and they're privy to them. But that meant a lot to me. And that sort of sums up the totality of Bill's life. He wasn't a perfect individual, but he was an incredible mind, and inspired so many people to become Baha'is, and still does. All right. Well, I'm sorry I'm hoarse, but I wasn't able to make my tea tonight because I was out chasing cows. So I'm going to stop sharing after we see our beautiful picture of the Center for the Study of the Text.